100%.
right?
I have so many things pinned from the last few minutes of conversation.
Okay.
We have to go back to. One of the things actually from like the conversation that was prior to this, which was just talking about decision making in the training industry and how people want there to be an easy answer to something that's complicated. And you brought up dynamic systems theory. And this is something that we'll bring up at all our courses. But like when you're working with another human, the reason why I can't give you an answer as to the very complicated question you asked me, although it didn't sound complicated, but if you ask me what to do with a human being, it's now complicated because everything is a system. So we are a dynamic system. We are a biological system. We are a complex system. We are a three-dimensional system. We are an adaptive system, and we are a nonlinear system. Each one of those is a rabbit hole within itself to have to explain what each one of those definitions of what kind of system that is, right? But we are all of those things at once. And I'd say, I think out of all of those, although they're all dense topics to dive into, the whole nonlinear thing is the thing that the fitness industry really struggles with. Is that if they ask a question like how many sets or how many reps or what exercise is best for my shoulder, it just popped, so what do I do? It's like, well, you're not a computer, you're a nonlinear system. There's no input that just equals the same output for every single human that does it every single time. So what do you mean what I do for your shoulder? You're asking me on the internet. I don't even know you. Right? So since you're a three-dimensional, complex, dynamic, biological, adaptive system, and it's specifically a nonlinear system, like the answer has to be much more harder to get to than you think. Like I have to ask you 100 questions to even get to the start of how I would start to think about answering that question, right? But especially if I don't have that person in front of me and I can't actually assess them, I can't get to the answer, which is why the internet is such a funny place that people think it's a good place to give advice and information. It's not, right? Which is why we stress so much like assessment over everything, FRA over everything, because that's where all the decision-making process starts because of the fact that we're a nonlinear system and it's complicated.
You know what, but I also do understand that people watching, people listening, people in internet and Instagram land, or they also may not be able to access a person that does FRA or take a course. So I don't want to leave them in the dark to say, well, fuck, now what do I can't do anything. So if we were to boil this down, if you injure yourself, calling it a pop is not good enough. I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're a simple-minded person when it comes to this. The fact is you should learn. You have to learn.
Right.
Like, there's no excuse. You don't have to learn economics. You don't have to learn accounting. You don't have to learn architecture. But you kind of have to have some kind of base knowledge with regards to the management and preservation of self.
Sure.
Right? And if you're telling me that you work out, you're telling me that you at least have an interest in learning.
Right.
Okay, so the first things first, when you get injured, you need a diagnosis.
Right.
Maybe 5 times out of 10, you don't need a diagnosis because you'll be fine, and to the extent that fine for you is, my shoulder doesn't hurt anymore, but I don't do jiu-jitsu anymore.
Right.
I just play cards, so you're fine.
Right.
But if you want anything more than fine, it behooves you to learn what has been injured. So now you get a diagnosis. What's the diagnosis? Muscle tear. Okay, there's things that you need to do with that muscle tear. Number one, you can't avoid the muscle that tore and let it heal. That's actually not what you want to do, because when a muscle is healing, it's always a race between the healing with good quality connective tissue and the healing with bad quality connective tissue. Right. If you do nothing, bad quality connective tissue wins. This is not I will not put this up for debate. It's been debated for as long as literature has existed. If you want to go back to the scar tissue I wish you saw podcast, right. I don't remember what number that podcast was with Dr. Stratsiotis. We've gone over the fact that injury does not lead. MRI studies, electron microscope studies, it's right there.
Right.
Injured tissue left to its own accord, injured tissue
the tissue will fill in.
It's going to fill in. Right. You're not going to be left with a gaping hole.
Right.
Just like if I slice you down your arm, your body just doesn't leave you with a gaping hole. Right. Even if it doesn't, the pieces it's going to fill in with some shit.
Right.
But the idea that that's good quality stuff is wrong.
Right.
Okay. So you need a diagnosis. I have a muscle tear. Okay, so what do you do with the muscle tear? Well, if you don't put forces into it, what happens is cells, we're going to bring this right down to a level where people can understand, right? When you injure something, your body sends out this cellular cascade. Certain cells get to the area, other cells turn on that were already dormant in the area. These are the cells which are going to rebuild your tissue. So now you have tissue, let's just call them tissue rebuilding cells that are in the area, okay? Now, those cells do not work on their own accord. They need information in order to know what to do, okay? So what's the information? Well, there's hormonal information, which might have cascaded their desire to go to that area, right? The inflammatory response.
Right.
But there are no hormonal signals telling them what to do while they're there.
Right.
They might have signals saying, deposit new tissue. Which tissue do they deposit? It's going to be the easiest one to produce that can get spit out the fastest. The key is, where do they deposit it? Unless there is some kind of force information going into that tissue, the cells that are tasked to create new tissue have no idea how to spread out this new tissue.
Right.
They're just sitting there, and then I guess I'll just put tissue here, put some over here, put some over here.
Right.
So they get this haphazard laying down of tissue, and haphazard tissue is not as robust as good quality tissue laid out in parallel bands.
Right.
So you get this tissue that fills the gap but cannot withstand forces.
Right.
So if you know exactly what muscle has been injured, yes, you let it heal, right? Some tips I tell you with a muscle tear. Don't let it heal with the muscle completely shortened. This is a bad idea. If you tear a bicep, not a full tear, you have to get surgery, but even if you do have to get surgery, or if you get a minor tear in that bicep, for sure don't strap it up like this and let it heal. Because what happens is the body is going to heal to this shape,
right.
And then when you take yourself out of the sling, now you have a problem.
Right.
So you do want to bring it to as much length as can be tolerated. Mm-hmm. Even when you're icing it or doing whatever you're doing, you want to put it at length, and you want to move it within pain-free ranges of motion such that you're not causing direct pain in the tissue being that was injured.
Right.
You know
and
what I mean?
A big thing is why people don't realize that's such a good thing is because at length
Yes.
is putting a little bit of directional load on it.
Yes.
Because you have that eccentric load that happens when your spindles all get signaled to that you're coming to an end range position. Even if it's a modified end range position right now because you're injured, right? It's still your brain saying, whoa, 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 we're done. So it puts that little bit of eccentric load on, which is a little bit of directional loading, which is why we don't want it to just be in that shortened position the whole time.
Length is a topic that is we can be in our seminars. We're very specific with the effective length, but to wrap it all up into a nutshell, without the input of length, there is no creation of new architecture.
Right.
Length is what creates this force that tells the system how to create new architecture. What's architecture? Architecture is what I'm referring to is the connective tissue scaffolding where muscles grow.
Right.
Again, this is taking muscles. The muscle that's injured it's a back seat in terms of the rehabilitation. I'm not trying to rehabilitate the muscle. The muscle will regenerate new muscle. That's not the problem.
Right.
It's where do you put the new muscle? If you have torn connective tissue, and I say deposit muscle where?
Right.
There must be a scaffolding in order to deposit muscle cells. That scaffolding is going to be made better with the input of length.
And if it doesn't, if you let the connective tissue just not get good inputs, it starts to become fatty deposits over time, which is not good architecture for muscle to grab onto.
It's not usable architecture that a muscle can use. It's right. So you do need to put length. You need to stress it at length in order to try to clear that range, eventually pain-free, right? This is a generic approach to muscles that have popped, right?
Right.
And then once that you've cleared that, how would you clear that? Well, you're going to put it at length, and then in order to increase the stimulus, you're going to start adding load to the length. Now, you notice that I'm just adding load to the length. What I'm not doing is telling the person to grab something, and within the length that's not painful, start to repeatedly do reps.
Right.
Why? Because when you start moving and repeatedly doing reps, you start to bias the exercise towards the creation of muscular tissue. Why? Because the way muscles move is where proteins slide past one another in a variety of different directions.
Right.
So the movement of these proteins, these movable proteins, is what is going to be emphasized when you're loading using movement.
Right.
But we just want to build that scaffolding. So you would start to load at length. Now, how much load? If you've damaged a tissue, you're going to start with no load,
Right.
which is isometric.
Which is the most load it could tolerate at that time.
At that time, which is why isometric starts the loading process. It's not because we like it. It's because that's what it does. It allows you to load that tissue without excessive weight, because you don't need that weight.
Right.
You need signal. So you really want to load at length a multitude of times throughout the day so that you continuously run that signal. And then as load tolerance gets higher, as you start to clear that range, then you can start to load the tissue and load it to length.
Yep.
Now we're jumping into the eccentric concepts. Yep. These eccentric concepts are going to take the signal, lay down new lines of tissue, which at one point isometric was enough. As you accommodate to those isometrics at certain angles, then you want to start adding load into that length, which is eccentric loading. Exactly in the same lines, not exactly the same line, but if you got injured that way, then you are going to be loading somewhat towards that injury.
Right.
If only because that is how to reverse engineer to load the tissue that got injured. What do they do in most rehab?
Avoid.
I have I don't know how many times I've heard, if you dislocate your shoulder anteriorly, for sure you want to avoid having your shoulder abduct and externally rotate.
Right.
Which is another way of saying, I don't want to speak to the tissues that were injured. I don't care if they're going to heal haphazardly. I just want them to carry on. You 100% have to load towards your injury. Hold on, let me just make sure I preface this by saying, if you're dealing with a joint instability, if you're dealing with a fracture, there are times, but we're just dealing with a muscle strain, right? You do need to load towards the area of the injury.